Hi everyone, sorry I couldn't be there today. Um, so before I jump into anything, I just have a quick quote for you. In the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer. Alright, so I recommend trying to jot down some notes on paper if you'd like. You don't have to follow me along in the modules because I realize I'm just going to be showing it to you on the screen. So if you want to take a second, pause, get some paper, and then be ready to go and press play when you're ready. But I'm going to be talking to you guys today about the classical template. But before I do that, just a couple of reminders. So don't forget, I know this weekend is a 3-day weekend, but your rough draft is going to be due Monday night at 11:59, emailed to me and to your peer review partner. I'm going to be emailing you your peer review partners either tonight, and if not, by the latest tomorrow. That way you know who your partner is before Monday. So you'll have to email those to me and your peer review partner on campus. Your rough drafts need to be a minimum of 3 to 4 pages. You really want to push yourself to try to get that 4-page minimum. That way next week when we're peer reviewing, you don't have as much work to do. It's more of a matter of going back through and fine-tuning instead of a matter of going back through and trying to fill in the rest of your paper. Now, that doesn't mean if you only get 1 page not to submit it. If for whatever reason you find come Monday night you still only have a page and a half, you still need to submit that so that we can peer review it and figure out what we can do to get you up to the correct page count. Because remember, you're going to be a minimum of 4 pages, max 6 pages. Which is why today's conversation is going to be super helpful, hopefully. So what the classical template is it's an organization structure or strategy that you can use in order to organize your paper. And it's a 6-part template. And what that means is if you play your cards right and you organize your paper correctly and you add in enough information, each component should be anywhere from half a page to a full page. If you're finding yourself writing about a half page for each of these, you're going to end up with 3 pages, meaning you only need to figure out another page. If you're mixing a half page and some full pages, you're going to end up anywhere between 4 and 5. And if you can write a full page for each, you're going to end up at your full 6-page mark following this template. So the 6 major components of the classical template are the exordium, the narration, the partition, the argument, the refutation, and the peroration. So these 3, the exordium, narration, and partition, are all going to be part of your introduction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about each of them, and I'm going to be showing you an example but using a piece of literary analysis. And it's a college level literary analysis, so if it's a little difficult to understand, I totally get it, but I just want you to see what each of these parts looks like in play. And I don't expect yours to necessarily be as advanced as the one I'm going to show you, but it's just a model for you to think about. So I'm going to go ahead and get started talking about the exordium. So you know what an exordium is. You are just unaware that you know. This is kind of similar to your paper's hook. Sophomore year and freshman year, when we've talked about writing the introduction to your paper, we've always talked about including a hook, something interesting to grab your reader's attention. The exordium is basically the same thing. It's basically a hook that tells your audience, kind of introduces them to the general topic without giving too much background information. It's okay to give a little bit, but what you really want to do in your exordium is give your audience a reason to care. You want to create that emotional appeal or that pathos. And something to keep in mind when doing any of the 6 parts, when creating any of the 6 parts, is the classical template is really focused on being aware of who your audience is and what their stance is on your argument. So each of these portions can be tailored to fit the type of audience. And remember, you can either have a hostile audience, a sympathetic audience, an uninformed audience, or an uninterested audience. Each of those are different. Remember, hostile is going to be completely against you. Sympathetic is already with you. They probably already know a lot about what you're talking about. Uninformed means they're interested about forming an opinion. They're neither with or against you because they don't have enough information to be with or against you. They just know the general of the topic. And then there is the uninterested, meaning they really don't care, so it's your job to make them to care. So the exordium addresses each of those by really trying to catch their interest. So you need to make sure you tailor it to your audience, because what you're doing, like I said, is you're introducing the audience to the subject. So for example, if you're writing to a hostile audience, you want to use the exordium to gain their trust. So if you remember when I talked about concessions earlier in the week, a concession is when you acknowledge the other side does make some pretty good points. You can do that early on, because when you concede early on that your opponent or your opposing side makes some very valid points, it's going to make them more opening to listen to you, because they recognize that you are informed, that you do agree with them on some certain points. So what you can do here is you can introduce yourself. No, you don't want to start with, "Hi, my name is Miss Smith and I'm a teacher at Irvine High School." You don't necessarily want to start like that, but you're basically explaining your credentials by demonstrating your knowledge of their opinions. And something else you want to do here is show how even if you disagree, you're still part of the same community. So if you're talking about the Green New Deal, and maybe you're for it and your audience is against it, you still want to point out that we are currently living in a country that is highly affected by pollution. So it's very important that we work together as a community to fix that issue. So you want to show what your connections to each other are, even if you're in disagreement with each other. Okay, so that's the type of hook or exordium you want to focus on for a hostile audience. If you're talking to a sympathetic audience, you don't really need to, I don't want to say suck up to them, but you don't necessarily need to suck up to them as much. You don't want to concede here early if you're talking to a sympathetic audience. I just recommend giving maybe an anecdote, something, a quick, interesting story that builds the exigency for you, the relevancy. So you could start by talking about the most recent event related to your topic, and then transition into what the next part of this template is, and I'll tell you about that in a second. So just to recap that, you want to just give them a brief introduction or a brief summary of the most recent event to help lead them into what's going to come next. And then if they're confused, the last type of audience here, you might want to talk about and acknowledge what can be seen as confusing in your topic. But I really want you guys to try to focus on either finding a sympathetic or a hostile audience. Because either the more confused or the more blatantly hostile they are, the harder it's going to be, the more explicit you're going to have to get in explaining your argument, explaining your evidence, and breaking it down. But yeah, so think of your exordium as your hook and establishing for your audience what the subject is and why they should care. Okay, so after you've done your exordium, you're going to transition into the narration. And the narration is the overall background information that they need in order to understand the argument that you're going to give. So this is where you would want to introduce, major players, important events, define any key terms that they might need to know to really understand what you're talking about. And backing up, when I say major players, I mean someone who is directly involved with the controversy that you're talking about, right? You're not necessarily a major player. You're a stakeholder who's affected by it. But for example, if we were talking about the Green New Deal, a major player would be AOC, the one who wrote it, Alexandria Cortez, maybe Trump because he's currently president, senators, they're all major players because they're all directly in charge of deciding whether or not the Green New Deal gets passed or denied. Okay, so an uninterested audience or an uninformed audience is going to need a lot of background information that really details those key terms because they're probably not going to know them. You definitely want to give them the important events and the major players. But what you also want to establish with this background information is, again, why your controversy is important. Because your whole goal is to get them to realize that they do need to be concerned about this. So you need to show them the background information that is going to make them feel concerned. When you're writing to a sympathetic audience, you're not going to need as much narration because a sympathetic, informed audience probably already has that background information. They're probably already going to trust you if they agree with you. So you can just keep it brief. Just give a quick overview of these three major components. But you don't really have to go as in depth as you do here or here. Wait, it doesn't talk about hostile. Oh, I skipped it. I'm so sorry. Hostile. A hostile audience is gonna require a longer narration. Like I said, you're uninterested and your hostile audience are gonna need a longer one to really kind of ease them into the topic because you don't want to just like brush over everything and then jump straight into your argument because it's going to really turn them off to wanting to listen to you. So for example, a really controversial topic right now that if you're on one side or the other, if you don't ease somebody into it, especially if they're hostile towards you, they're not going to want to listen or get into it because it can get pretty heated pretty quickly, is the medical marijuana argument. So if you're talking to somebody who supports legalization and you're talking about making medical marijuana illegal or not legalizing the entire drug as a whole, then you don't want to just outright start with, oh, here's my brief history. We need to keep marijuana outlawed. They're going to automatically be turned off by your argument. So maybe instead you start with an extended, meaning a longer narration of the drug's history. Because even though they might already know the history, like the laws and the effects, you can use that history to start giving reasons as to why they should be worried about, maybe some negative side effects of marijuana use. And in doing that, you're going to kind of open them up, to listening to you further. Because remember, like I said, you really want to appeal to them in your introduction about why they should care. Okay? So then the last part of the introduction is the partition. And what the partition is it's like your thesis statement, except it's a little longer than that. It's not just your principal claim or your thesis statement. You're also explaining how you're going to build your argument. So I really like the way they word it here. It's basically where you're telling your audience, hear ye, this is what I will say, and this is how I'm going to say it. But you have to be careful because, again, if you're writing to like a confused audience and you just give this really long, detailed explanation of your argument, you're going to confuse them more. So you want to find a good balance. So I'm going to show you an example of these three things in play. And like I said, if the article itself is confusing, that's okay. I just want you to see how they use the exordium, the narration, and the partition. So the article I'm going to be showing you is, let me zoom in, it's really small, is called Right Worshipful Masters, Letters of Request and Servants, Scripting of Margaret Patson's Social Self. So this is a literary analysis of some letters from the Middle Ages, but she does a really good job of using the classical template to open this. So this right here is her exordium, it's her hook. And it says, Margaret Pattenson's influential role in managing the Pattenson family's affairs in her capacity as wife, mother, and widow has been well documented. Garnering less attention, however, has been Margaret's role as the mistress of her household. Not mistress, mastress of her household, and the influence she exercised in governing the estate servants with whom she collaboratively managed the Patson family estate business. Examining the highly political speech activity of request enacted in the petitionary letters servants addressed to Margaret offers a rare opportunity to examine the rhetorical impact of these letters in the dialogue, shaping an expression of Margaret's honor or worship, a critical aspect of her social self, and influence in the course of estate management. So it's basically opening up by pointing out, hey, we've totally studied these letters before in the past. However, people are really missing this really interesting aspect of Margaret's life, and that was that she had power that other women during this time didn't necessarily have. So it's her hook, it makes it interesting. And then it jumps into the background information about these letters and about who has studied them. So it's giving me the background information and the major players. So I'm going to go ahead and read it. Born of an established, respected Norfolk family, Margaret Pattenson brought the Pattenson family through her marriage to John Pattenson I. Not only several desirable properties, but also the legitimizing gentle status and social connections this provincial parvenu family so desperately needed. With the exception of her mother-in-law, Agnes Pattenson, also of gentle birth, meaning not high class, Margaret was the only other Patson woman of any pedigree to guide her husband and children on how to conduct themselves in an honorable way. Not surprisingly, Margaret emerges from the Patson correspondence as the household's arbiter in defining what actions and alliances could enhance or diminish its members' worship. In addition to augmenting the Patson family honor through marriage, she was also an active agent in its protection, the most prolific letter writer in the family. Margaret frequently used her letters to guide, counsel, and some might even say bully family members into walking, or at the very least towing an honorable line. In addressing the role Margaret's letter writing performed in expressing her concern for and maintenance of honor, Roger Dalrymple has demonstrated how Margaret purposefully used her words to counter or redress the irksome lies, rumors, gossip, or to borrow Margaret's descriptor, noise that threatened to damage the Patson's family honor. In this way, she used her letters as a political tool to help maintain and broker her family's social reputation. Indeed, Margaret seemed to learn early on that the impact her letter writing could have in managing aspects of her family's social identity. As Rebecca Krug claims, so basically, as you can see, she's giving the background information, right? She tells me who this lady that she's talking about is, what she did in her family, and then it kind of transitioned into who the major players talking about this are. You can see the Robert and the Rebecca are talking about it. And then here towards the end, we can find her peroration, where she's transitioning into specifically what her argument is going to be. And she says, less attention, however, has been directed towards Margaret's role as the mistress of her household, and the role household and estate servants might also have had in the social expression and cultivation of her worship. My intention here is therefore to examine the epistolary expressions of servants' requests in order to show how the textual strategies present in their petitionary letters could also contribute to the shaping of Margaret Patson's identity as their right worshipful mistress. So you can see right here, this brief sentence is the peroration. It's telling us what her argument is. She's going to be examining the epistolary expressions. Epistolary means letters. So she's going to be looking at the writing of this woman's servants and how they addressed her in their letters to contribute to the shaping of her identity as their master. Okay, so to recap, exordium, hook, this narration, background information about who Margaret is and who the major players are, and then transition into what her argument is and how she's going to be building that argument. So if you notice, the exordium is like a paragraph, the narration is a couple paragraphs, and the peroration here is like arguably 2 sentences, but in reality it's like 1 sentence. Okay, and I know this is a little different than what you're going to be doing because that's a literary analysis, but you're generally going to be following that same flow for your introduction. Okay, so introduction out of the way. We're more than halfway through this. Then you jump into your argument. So this is where we've introduced everything now. We've given the background information. We've established why they should care. Now this is where you make your major point. So if you remember last week, earlier in the week, we talked about the 5 major types of argument. And to refresh your memory on those, you have the induction argument, which is based on patterns. You have the analogy argument, which is based on comparing and looking at the similarities between 2 things. You have the difference argument, which is contrasting and looking at the differences between 2 things. You have the definition argument, where you are creating pathos through the words you choose to define your topic. And then you have the causation argument, which is what cause leads to what effect. By looking at either reading the signs, establishing a sequence, or looking at the correlation between 2 events. Okay, so you can either use any 5 of those right here in this part. So depending on which type of argument you pick, it may or may not be the longest part of your essay. And then the argument itself must be arranged. So that's why I said you definitely want to pick one of those 5 argumentative styles, because when you really have a clean, clearly demonstrated argument, that's how you earn your audience's trust and you build your ethos, or you build your own credibility by giving your argument a logical flow. So all of that happens here. Okay. So then after you've given your argument, this is where let me double check something. Yes. This is where you would concede and refute. So remember, if you were writing to a hostile audience, you conceded early, but you never want to refute early. You never want to refute in your introduction. Because that, again, it's going to automatically turn your audience off to what you're doing. So you want to give your refutation for a hostile audience after you build your argument. You want to give your concession and your reputation after your argument if you're writing to a sympathetic audience. So remember, in this part, I'm going to talk more about if you're writing to a sympathetic audience here. This is where you'd be like, they make really good points here, however, and then you go through and you try to break that argument. So that's where you need to try to figure out what type of argument the opposition that you're using is making. So remember, if they're making an induction argument based on a pattern, you just have to break the pattern. If they're using an analogy argument and they're looking at the similarities, you just have to demonstrate that there are actually some differences. If you're using a difference argument, if they're using a difference argument, then remember you just have to establish similarities. If they're making a definition argument, you need to show that they're missing aspects of the definition. They chose to leave some things out. And lastly, if there's a cause and effect argument that your opponent is making, you want to look at and show that there are other types of causes or ways to explain where that effect came from. So you need to go back through and review those types of refutation, and that's what you would choose to plug in right here. So once you've done that, then you're going to end your paper with your peroration. This should be the last thing that your audience reads. If you're writing to a confused audience or an uninterested audience, you want to restate your claim, remind them of what you've said and of what your argument was and why they should care. Now, if you're writing to any other type of audience aside from confused, here are some ways you can do that. If any of you had Miss Wydra last year, she called this part the prognosticate. So it's basically you get them to care and want to go do something. So if you're writing to a sympathetic audience, you can give them some reasons to feel. You can take a second to create one last emotional appeal to make them feel really strongly and really commit to being on the same side as you. And you can even take it a step further by suggesting things they can go out and do to take action on that. If you're writing to, another way, if you're writing to the sympathetic audience, you can also give them reasons to believe something new. So you can leave them with a completely new belief. And then the two ways to address a hostile audience in your peroration. First, you can, in the introduction, remember I talked about how you've established that you're a member of the same community? Well, here, because you've just shot them down with your refutation before this, so you need to bring them back onto your side so they don't leave your argument feeling angry. They leave your argument feeling willing to consider the things you've said. You want to remind them one more time that you're a member of the same community and that while you disagree, you guys still care about the same things. So that way you leave them trusting you and feeling open-minded. And then lastly, you can also concede one more time about maybe some points that you couldn't refute. So if you found that they had a couple solid points that you couldn't prove wrong, you could mention those here and say, well, there were weaknesses in this part of the argument. You do make some good points when you say this, this, and this. Overall, you're just creating that one last emotional appeal to get them on your side. And that's it. Those are the 6 major parts of your essay. So like you saw, some of them can be a page long, some of them can be a couple paragraphs, some of them can be 1 sentence long. And in case you forgot, that's right here. 6.3 through 6.3.6. The other modules I referenced were refuting. Here's the refutation. 5.4.1 through 5.4.5. And then the types of argument, I gave you guys the PowerPoint. Refer back to the PowerPoint, unless you really want to go through all of Unit 4. Okay? If you have any questions, definitely message me on Remind, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Don't forget to be working on your rough drafts because they're going to be due Monday at 11:59 p.m. And I will see you guys next week. Enjoy your weekends. Enjoy your 3-day weekends. Be safe.